Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Delusion of Crowds, Why People Go Mad in Groups, by William J. Bernstein, narrated by Tom Parks. Publisher's Note: This audiobook refers to figures included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Prelude. Nearly 2 centuries ago, a young Scotsman named Charles Mackay simultaneously attacked the subjects of God and Mammon in memorable style. Born in 1814, he enjoyed a distinguished literary career as a popular poet, writer of ballads, and American Civil War correspondent and editor for British newspapers. But posterity remembers him best for his 1841 authorship, at the tender age of 27, of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, which narrated multiple historical episodes of mass mania, several of which had to do with either religion or money. It has been in print ever since. Mackay chronicled the end times delusions that supposedly gripped Europe as it approached the year AD 1000, as well as the remarkable religious madness of the Crusades. The book's best-known chapters, though, detail the financial mass delusions of the Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s and the twin stock market bubbles in Paris and London in 1719 to 1720. These episodes, which constitute the first 3 chapters, are what propelled the book to its long-lasting fame. Successive financial manias followed the book's publication with such frequency, regularity, and global impact that nearly 2 centuries after it was written, the book is still required reading among finance professionals. Mackay was certainly not the first to intuit the contagious nature of human irrationality. Consider, for example, this passage from Herodotus. When Darius was king of Persia, he summoned the Greeks, who happened to be present at his court, and asked them what they would take to eat the dead bodies of their fathers. They replied that they would not do it for any money in the world. Later, in the presence of the Greeks and through an interpreter, so that they could understand what was said, he asked some Indians, of the tribe called Calatia, who do in fact eat their parents' dead bodies, what they would take to burn them. They uttered a cry of horror and forbade him to mention such a dreadful thing. One can see by this what custom can do, and Pindar, in my opinion, was right when he called it king of all. The Greeks, after all, were antiquity's intellectuals, and Darius must have been tickled to box their rhetorical ears. His unspoken messages to the Greeks: "You may be the most learned among humankind, but you are just as irrational as the rest of us. You are simply better at rationalizing just why, despite all evidence to the contrary, you are still right." While the ancients and Mackay were well acquainted with human irrationality and popular manias, they could not know their precise biological, evolutionary, and psychosocial wellsprings. Mackay, for example, must have asked himself exactly why groups of people, from time to time, chase the same ludicrously overpriced investments en masse. Today, we have a much better idea of how this happens. In the first place, financial economists have discovered that human beings intuitively seek out outcomes with very high but very rare payoffs, such as lottery tickets that on average lose money, but tantalize their buyers with the chimera of unimaginable wealth. In addition, over the past several decades, neuroscientists have uncovered the basic anatomic and psychological mechanism behind both greed and fear, the so-called limbic system, which lies close by the vertical plane that divides the brain between its right and left hemispheres. One symmetrically placed pair of the limbic system structures, the nuclei accumbens, singular nucleus accumbens, lie approximately behind each eye, while another pair, the amygdalae, singular amygdala, sit just under the temples. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Researchers have found that the nuclei accumbens fire not only with reward, but even more intensely with its anticipation, be it culinary, sexual, social, or financial. In contrast, the amygdalae fire with disgust, fear, and revulsion. If, for example, you adore your Aunt Flo's lasagna, your nuclei accumbens and their connections will fire ever more rapidly on the way over to her house, and likely peak just as the aroma wafts from the serving dish. But as soon as the first bite is taken, their firing rate decreases, and if your aunt informs you upon arrival that she's burned the dish, they will almost completely cease firing. The benefit of an active anticipatory circuitry seems obvious. Mother Nature favors those who anticipate and strive, whereas the enjoyment of satiation, once achieved, offers little evolutionary advantage. And few things likely stimulate the nuclei accumbens, as does the knowledge that some of those around us are becoming effortlessly wealthy. As economic historian Charles Kinderberger observed, there is nothing so disturbing to one's well-being and judgment as to see a friend get rich. Novelists and historians have known for centuries that people do not deploy the powerful human intellect to dispassionately analyze the world, but rather to rationalize how the facts conform to their emotionally derived preconceptions. Journalist David Halberstam's magisterial "The Best and the Brightest" illustrated how the nation's most brilliant policymakers deluded themselves about American military involvement in Vietnam, a tendency once again evident. Our recent foreign adventures suggest that we have not successfully climbed that particular learning curve. Over the past several decades, psychologists have accumulated experimental data that dissect the human preference of rationalization over rationality. When presented with facts and data that contradict our deeply held beliefs, we generally do not reconsider and alter those beliefs appropriately. More often than not, we avoid contrary facts and data. And when we cannot avoid them, our erroneous assessments will occasionally even harden, and yet more amazingly, make us more likely to proselytize them. In short, human rationality constitutes a fragile lid perilously balanced on the bubbling cauldron of artifice and self-delusion so lucidly illustrated by Mackay. Mackay's own behavior demonstrated just how susceptible even the most rational and well-informed observers can be to a financial mania. Shortly after he published Extraordinary Popular Delusions in 1841, England experienced a financial mania that revolved around the great high-tech industry of the time, the railroad, which was even larger than the twin bubbles that swept Paris and London in 1719 to 1720. Investors, greedy for stocks, underwrote the increase in England's track mileage from 2,000 in 1843 to 5,000 in 1848, and thousands of more miles were planned but never built when shares finally went bust. If anyone should have foreseen the collapse, it was Mackay. He did not. During that mania, he served as the editor of the Glasgow Argus, where he covered the ongoing railroad construction with a notable lack of skepticism. And when he published the second edition of Extraordinary Popular Delusions in 1852, he gave it only a brief footnote. Financial manias can be thought of as a tragedy, like Hamlet or Macbeth, with sharply defined characters, a familiar narrative arc, and well-rehearsed lines. 4 dramatis personae control the narrative: the talented yet unscrupulous promoters of schemes, the gullible public who buys into them, the press that breathlessly fans the excitement, and last, the politicians who simultaneously thrust their hands into the till and avert their eyes from the flaming pyre of corruption. The promoters follow a classical Shakespearean tragic path, and are consequently the most fascinating of the actors. Most begin as brilliant, hard-working visionaries who intuit before others the riches that a new technology will bestow upon society. In the process of bringing their visions to fruition, they grow rich and powerful, and, in a capitalist society that judges men by their wealth, become their nation's lions. When the speculation runs its course and bursts, they wind up disgraced and bankrupt, and usually, but not always, narrowly escape the jailer. The public proves easy pickings for the blandishments of the heroic, charismatic promoters. Competent investing requires a rare combination of mathematical ability, technological expertise, and, most critically, a working knowledge of economic history. Alas, people greatly prefer stories to data and facts. When faced with such a daunting task, humans default into narrative mode, and perhaps the most pleasing story of all is one that involves the effortless wealth to be had from buying into a new technology. The press falls prey to the promoters in the same way as the public. Few things corrode journalistic excellence as the ease of writing about the revolutionary ventures of brilliant businessmen who, with alarming frequency, grace magazine covers, first as heroes, then as accused felons. Finally, financial manias sweep into their ambit politicians, whose reputations and popularity are enhanced by the economic prosperity that temporarily results from speculative excess, and who not infrequently get caught raiding the cookie jar. The narrative arc of financial manias does not vary much either. Most speculative episodes combine two factors: exciting new technologies that foretell prosperity for all, and easy credit. Today, in the United States, only about 10% of the money supply consists of actual circulating bills and coins. The rest exist as credit that can be created, within limits, at will, by the banking system. That, in turn, depends upon how optimistic banks, mortgage companies, and other lenders are that they will be repaid. This process is such a counterintuitive and shocking notion that it bears repeating. Banks print money. Indeed, they are as manic-depressive as the public they serve, and in the midst of the euphoria of a bubble, banks often fan the flames of speculation by making money with abandon, as occurred most spectacularly in the run-up to the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. 4 characteristic subplots accompany a bubble. First and foremost, financial speculation begins to dominate all but the most mundane social interactions. Whenever and wherever people meet, they talk not of the weather, family, or sports, but rather of stocks and real estate. Next, otherwise sensible professionals quit reliable, good-paying jobs to speculate in the aforementioned assets. Further, skepticism is often met with vehemence. While there are always some folks old enough and with memories long enough to have seen the play before and to know how it ends, their warnings are met with scorn and ridicule, which, over the past several decades, has been usually capped with these 5 words: "You just don't get it." Finally, normally sedate observers begin to make outlandish financial forecasts. Asset prices are predicted to not merely move 10, 20, or 30% up or down in a given year, but rather will double, triple, or add a zero. Beyond its 3 chapters on financial manias, Extraordinary Popular Delusions also contained 3 long chapters on religious manias, one each on biblical prophecy, the Crusades, and the pursuit of witches. While religious and financial manias might seem to have little in common, the underlying forces that give them rise are identical: the desire to improve one's well-being in this life or the next. And the factors that amplify the contagion of financial and religious mass delusions are also similar: the hardwired human propensity to imitate, to fabricate and consume compelling narratives, and to seek status. Religious manias seem a near constant feature of human history, a fairly recent example of which was the Solar Temple tragedy. On the evening of October 4, 1994, residents of the Swiss village of Céry were startled by flames coming from a farmhouse perched above the town, where firefighters encountered a bizarre, ghastly sight. 22 bodies, most wearing red, black, or white capes, with a few women wearing golden ones. All but 3 of the victims had been shot, and in addition, 10 had plastic bags over their heads. Most were found lying in a circle, their heads pointed outward. Shell casings and empty champagne bottles littered the floor. This was only the beginning. Over the next 2.5 years, dozens more murder/suicide victims were discovered in Switzerland and Canada. A total of 74 dead, all sect members or their children. All of the deaths that followed those at Céry occurred within a few days of either an equinox or solstice. 2 men led the sect, a mysterious, charming, and attractive 46-year-old Belgian physicist named Luc Jouret, who had fled conspiracy and weapons charges in Canada in 1993, and a 70-year-old French-Canadian named Joseph de Montbrot. Among the eventual victims were the wife and son of Jean Vornet, a revered 1960 French Olympic ski gold medalist who later licensed his famous name to an international sunglass manufacturer. Before his death, the young Vornet told a reporter, "The theme of the passage from life to death came up again and again." Jouret explained that there was nothing to fear. Quite the contrary. I began to feel close to sacrifice. The last Solar Temple victims were discovered on March 24, 1997. 2 days later, police in Rancho Santa Fe near San Diego found the bodies of 39 members of another end-times group, the Heaven's Gate religious sect, who had also died around the same equinox and believed that after death they would be transported off the planet by a spacecraft hidden in the tail of comet Hale-Bopp. The Solar Temple and the Heaven's Gate religious sects are just 2 examples in a long list of well-known modern apocalyptic end-times groups. Jim Jones's People's Temple, whose mass suicide/murders in Guyana in 1978 took the lives of 918. The Branch Davidians, whose standoff with clueless federal authorities in Waco, Texas, killed 86 in 1993. And the murderous Japanese Aum Shinrikyo Doomsday Group, who perpetrated the 1995 Tokyo subway nerve gas attack. What's striking about all these groups is that so many of their members, like Jouret and Vornet, were highly educated and accomplished. Nor are end-times mass delusions peculiar to the modern world. Medieval Europe produced a bumper crop of spectacular, if less well-remembered, episodes. Modern neuropsychological research sheds some light on why groups of otherwise sane, intelligent, and well-adjusted people delude themselves that the world is going to end in a particular way, and oftentimes on a particular date. Humans understand the world through narratives. However much we flatter ourselves about our individual rationality, a good story, no matter how analytically deficient, lingers in the mind, resonates emotionally, and persuades more than the most dispositive facts or data. More recently, psychologists have begun to appreciate just how effectively arresting narratives corrode our analytical ability. Perhaps the most compelling of all stories is the end times narrative. If we understand our existence in narrative, then we all want to know its denouement. The end time story is solidly embedded in many of the world's religions, and especially in all 3 Abrahamic ones, so pervasive that it has become nearly invisible, lurking behind many of every day's headlines and tweets, and so old that it goes at least as far back as, and likely further than, the dawn of civilization. Not only does the hunger to know the rest of the story gnaw deeply into our consciousness, end times narratives possess yet another irresistible attraction: the promise of delivery from a human existence famously labeled by Thomas Hobbes as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and pervaded with a corruption that favors the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the righteous. Few narratives comfort as well as one that promises the return of a Savior who will turn over the table and set things right. This yearning for mankind's fresh start is deeply embedded in the Bible, most especially in the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation, which have supplied the blueprints for several bloody end times movements. The nascent field of evolutionary psychology provides a convincing mechanism for the spread of mass manias. Within the space of approximately 10,000 years after the first tribes crossed over from Siberia into North America at the end of the last ice age, humans had established themselves from the subarctic to the Great Plains to the tropical Amazon basin. Biological evolution could not have proceeded rapidly enough to favor the very specific skills needed to survive in such varied environments. It would have taken far too long, for example, to have evolved a genetically derived talent for kayak making on the subarctic coast, then a talent for buffalo hunting on the Great Plains, followed by one for making poison blowguns in the Amazon. The most rapid known human evolutionary adaptations, the development of adult lactose tolerance among northern Europeans and high-altitude tolerance in Tibetans, are estimated to have taken 3,000 to 10,000 years. Rather than hardwire into our genes a distinct ability for making kayaks, hunting buffalo, or fashioning poison blowguns, evolution instead encoded the general purpose skill of imitation. Given a large enough population and enough trial and error, someone will eventually figure out how to build, for example, a serviceable kayak, and the rest can accurately imitate the process. We imitate more than other animal species. As soon as someone creates a useful innovation, others quickly adopt it. Yet our propensity to imitate also serves to amplify maladaptive behaviors, primarily among which are delusional beliefs. Admittedly, in a modern, post-industrial society, the imitative acquisition of skills does improve our economic potential, but it does far less to promote survival than it did, say, in the pre-modern era in the subarctic, Great Plains, or Amazon basin. Thus, in the modern world, the trade-off between imitating adaptive and maladaptive behaviors has become less favorable than it had been in the past, and we are now stuck with a late Pleistocene imitative predisposition that has become increasingly costly in the modern age, one of the most expensive and dangerous being the spread of the belief that the world will soon end. Not only do people respond more to narratives than to facts and data, but preliminary studies demonstrate that the more compelling the story, the more it erodes our critical thinking skills. This research suggests, in addition, an inherent conflict of interest between the suppliers and consumers of opinion. The former wish to convince and will devise the most compelling narratives possible, whereas the latter, if they are rational, should intentionally avoid those narratives and rely only on data, facts, and analytical discipline. Closely related to our preference for compelling narratives is the human tendency for self-deception. Since humans are adept at detecting the tells that others are lying, the ability to deceive oneself eliminates the tells and so makes one a better deceiver. Throughout history, relatively few of the protagonists of religious mass delusions were the con men they seemed to skeptical outsiders, but rather the sincerely self-deceived victims of their own delusions. Beginning about 150 years ago, Protestant Christianity evolved a doctrine, technically known as dispensational premillennialism, for short, dispensationalism, which its modern advocates have honed into the world's most compelling end-times narrative. Although its precise content varies depending on the theological flavor, the basic narrative predicts that the Jews return to Israel, rebuild the Jerusalem temple, and there resume sacrifices. The Roman Empire then reassembles itself in the form of a 10-member confederation under the leadership of a charismatic, brilliant, and handsome individual who turns out to be the Antichrist, the earthly manifestation of the devil, who enters into a 7-year alliance with the Jews. After 3.5 years, the Antichrist betrays the Jews and thus precipitates an invasion of Israel not only by the Russians, but also by 200 million Chinese who travel over the Himalayas to get there. A cataclysmic nuclear war ensues. Armageddon, along with other horrors, collectively known as the Tribulation. At the end of the 7-year period, Christ returns to defeat the Antichrist and establish the millennium. Along the way, billions die. Christians who have found Jesus are conveniently saved from Armageddon and the tribulation by being transported up into heaven, the rapture, which occurs right before the trouble starts. The Jews come off somewhat less well. A third of them convert to Christianity and proselytize the rest of humanity, and so survive the tribulation. The other 2/3 are out of luck. The current polarization of American society cannot be fully understood without a working knowledge of the previous dispensationalist narrative, which strikes the majority of well-educated citizens with a secular orientation as bizarre. In contrast, for a significant minority of Americans, this sequence of prophesied events is as familiar as Romeo and Juliet or The Godfather, and the appeal of televangelists such as Jerry Falwell, Jim Bakker, and Jimmy Swaggart rest solidly on their dispensationalist credentials. Several reasons dictate concern about the prevalence of the dispensationalist end-times narrative. The centrality of Israel, and particularly the rebuilding of the temple to this belief system, has profoundly affected U.S. Middle East policy. Uncritical American support for Israel's expansion of West Bank settlement and its apparent abandonment of a two-state solution can be traced directly to the advocacy of evangelicals, so-called Christian Zionists, who now exert far more influence than Jewish Zionists. Indeed, the opening and closing benedictions at the May 2018 dedication of the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem were given by 2 dispensationalist ministers. One of them, Robert Jeffress, once claimed that Hitler had helped plan the Jews' return to Israel, and the other, John Hagee, had deemed Hurricane Katrina God's punishment for New Orleans' sinfulness. Even a mild degree of fatalism about the inevitability of Armageddon in the nuclear age is dangerous. A 2010 Pew Foundation poll found that more than 1/3 of Americans believe that Jesus will return in their lifetime, and most of those believe in the rapture. One such American was Ronald Reagan, who could discourse knowledgeably about dispensational theology with the likes of Jerry Falwell. In the same vein, evangelicals, most of whom are dispensationalists, make up nearly 1/4 of the U.S. military. Their influence is particularly prominent at the Air Force Academy, whose service branch operates most of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In 1964, when Daniel Ellsberg and his boss at RAND, who had both just audited the U.S. nuclear chain of command, screened Dr. Strangelove, a movie about a psychotic SAC general fixated on the fluoridation of drinking water, an obsession shared even today by a few dispensationalists who triggers the Third World War, they remarked that the film could well have been a documentary. Throughout history, Christians have labeled Jews as the Antichrist, the very concept of which is explosive. Even today, for a few extremist evangelicals, applying that label to someone or to any group justifies their murder. Finally, dispensationalism alone can and does occasionally trigger mass death, as occurred in 1983 at Waco, Texas.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?